This is Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. The headlines. More fallout after the airstrikes on Syria. The U.S. threatens new sanctions against Russia over its support for President Assad. A week on from the alleged chemical attack in Douma, one young resident describes her pain and distress.
We went back down to the basement and saw how they were bringing in the martyrs. Instead of breathing air, we breathed the smell of blood.
And I'm Karen Giannoni here in London. Also in the programme, hundreds of Australian firefighters battle a huge bushfire threatening southern Sydney. Police say it may have been started deliberately. And capturing the sound of the stars, NASA's new mission to seek Earth-like worlds and alien life.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Glad you could join us. It's 8 in the morning here in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London, and 8 in the evening in Washington, D.C., where the United States is preparing new sanctions against Russia, targeting companies supplying Damascus with chemical weapons capability. President Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, warned that any further Western missile strikes against Syria would cause international chaos. Syria's president has been meeting Russian politicians in Damascus, and he's reported to have been invited to visit Moscow, a sign that President Putin continues to fully support his government. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen.
In Damascus, journalists were shown one of the targets. The Syrians deny it was a chemical and biological weapon site. The attacks were limited, a punishment, a message that the West won't tolerate the use of chemical weapons. The operation was designed to minimize the risks of starting a new war by avoiding Russians and Iranians, the Syrian regime's main allies. The Russians still insist that the attack in Douma a week ago was a conspiracy organized by Britain. But these desperate attempts to decontaminate civilians and pictures of many others who died in agony foaming at the mouth prompted military action by the US, France and the UK. Deya al-Mohammed, his wife al-Noor and their children were among hundreds who were treated that traumatic night. Their daughter Massa's face, her pain and distress went around the world. Now the BBC's managed to track them down to the relative safety of a camp in northern Syria. The family's detailed accounts seem to corroborate the use of chemical weapons.
People were dying. Suddenly the civil defense came. They put us on the ground and poured water on us. Then they took us to the medical center, sprayed us, gave us injections. I was fainting. My heart was aching. When we went to sleep, the plane shelled and we were covered in dust. We went back down to the basement and saw how they were bringing in the martyrs. Instead of breathing air, we breathed the smell of blood.
I saw white smoke like fog. Our legs started to get weak. We started to lose the nerves in our legs. Had a shortness of breath and burning in the nose and chest. There was no oxygen, and we were fighting death to go upstairs and reach the higher floors.
Massa's father, Deya al-Mohammed, says he heard a helicopter. The rebels don't have them, and the accusation is that the regimes delivered chemical weapons.
After 4 to 5 minutes, regime started to shell us with artillery and rockets. After some moments, a helicopter passed over and some guys told us to go down one floor.
President Assad met Russian politicians, with his regime, its air force and helicopters untouched by the weekend's attacks. The US, France and Britain decided against forcing regime change years ago. No wonder the president looked relaxed. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
Well, our correspondent Chris Buckler is in Washington, and he explained to me that while the military action has stopped, diplomacy continues.
think the conversations have now begun about exactly what happens next. And certainly you're right in saying that the military action is done. And certainly from the Pentagon's point of view, that was clear on the evening itself, saying it was a one-time shot. The bigger question is about just what happens inside Syria. And there have been these questions, even before we had these strikes, about what President Trump's real feeling about Syria was. He had talked about trying to remove 2,000 US troops from Syria, about leaving it to other people. Now, there seems to have been a change of mind there, and certainly President Macron of France is making clear that he feels that he helped change President Trump's mind about that, because there were some inside the administration who believed he was going to come back to the subject in about 6 months' time. And if you listen to the US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, today, she was making very, very clear that basically they have got a number of priorities in Syria, and it is not just defeating the so-called Islamic State group, which has always been President Trump's big concern about Syria and indeed the Middle East, and really from his point of view why they were there. But there are other things being added now, like the use of chemical weapons. And as a result, you are starting to get a feeling from America's point of view that they're taking Syria more seriously as a wider problem. But I'm not sure that necessarily means that they have developed a wider strategy.
Chris, a lot of debate, particularly today here in the UK, about the airstrikes and whether the British Prime Minister should have gone ahead without the consent of the Parliament. What is the political reaction there in the US? How broad is the support for what the US and its partners did?
I mean, there are some Democrats who have raised some concerns, really saying if there was going to be more of a military action inside Syria, that it should be discussed with Congress. But I think generally those pictures that came out of Duma did shock many people, and that crossed the political divide. There isn't really a concern about the military action that took place, but it is about that other question, about whether or not there is a wider military strategy. And I think what you're going to see in America is this continued push about exactly what are the plans. And that's going to come on two fronts. There are some President Trump supporters, for example, who will be saying, listen, you campaigned on the idea of America first. You campaigned on the idea that this was all about looking after this nation's interests and not looking after the wider world. We are not a global policeman, as President Trump was at times keen to point out. Things have really changed from that point of view, I suppose, whenever you're starting to say about exactly what the plan in Syria is. And there will, of course, be others on the other side who say, could America be doing more?
Chris Buckler there in Washington, D.C. Let's now take a look at some of the day's other news. And King Salman of Saudi Arabia has opened the Arab League summit by criticizing what he called Iran's blatant interference in regional affairs. But in spite of rivalries with Tehran, the king made no mention of Saturday's airstrikes on Syrian chemical weapons facilities.
We renew our strong condemnation of Iran's terrorist acts in the Arab region, and we reject its blatant interference in the internal affairs of Arab countries.
Also making news today, North Korea is commemorating the birth of the country's founder, Kim Il-sung. Thousands of devotees attended the ceremony in Monsu Hill in the center of Pyongyang and laid flowers before statues of Kim and his son, Kim Jong-il. Demonstrators in the Indian capital of Delhi have held a silent protest in support of rape victims following a number of high-profile cases. A second person has been arrested in connection with the alleged rape of a teenager by a politician from the governing BJP party. Former U.S. First Lady Barbara Bush is said to be in failing health and no longer seeking medical treatment. A statement from the office of her husband, former President George Bush Sr., said the 92-year-old has chosen to focus on comfort care. And now let's watch this. A Chinese woman driver hit 5 vehicles in a parking lot while allegedly driving under the influence of alcohol. Security camera footage revealed her crashing into a minivan and damaging 4 scooters before leaving her car and slapping a startled security guard.
The Islamic State group says it was responsible for killing 2 Christians and injuring 7 more in a targeted attack in western Pakistan. Officials said the assailants in Quetta, capital of Balochistan province, shot at worshippers from a motorbike as they left church. Lebu Diseko has more.
They were leaving their place of worship when they became victims of terror. Gunmen on motorbikes, apparently from the so-called Islamic State, opening fire on these people as they left church.
The injured people belong to the Christian community. We rushed the injured to the hospital. 2 of the injured, who were in a serious condition, died later.
The drive-by shooting happened in Quetta, the capital of Balochistan, an area that's seen its fair share of violence and a minority group that has done too. It's here that 4 members of a Christian family were gunned down after Easter, and at least 10 were killed by suicide bombers in a church a week before Christmas. IS said it carried out those attacks too. As night fell, the anger was visible, protesters blocking roads and burning tyres on the streets. But given the violence and instability in this province, it's unlikely to be the last time that this community and others find themselves being targeted. Lebu Diseko, BBC News.
Bushfires burning out of control near Sydney, with the flames now threatening some streets around 35 kilometers from the city centre. Hundreds of people have been forced to leave their homes, and Australian police say they suspect the blaze may have been started deliberately. Phil Mercer has the details from Sydney.
Strong winds have pushed the flames towards suburban streets about 35 kilometres from the centre of Sydney. As the blaze approached, many residents left, while others stayed to join a huge firefighting effort. Authorities said the fast-moving outbreak was aggressive and unpredictable. While 500 firefighters confronted the inferno on the ground, they were supported in the skies by more than a dozen aircraft. Very warm autumn weather and a lack of rain have turned bushland on Sydney's outer fringes into a tinderbox.
We have to deal with the worst that Mother Nature can throw at us, and the worse Australians are presented with by nature, the better it brings out the Australian spirit.
Conditions in the fire zone are reported to be easing, but crews will again be working through the night to try to contain the blaze. Southeastern Australia is one of the world's most fire-prone regions. Most outbreaks are sparked by lightning or accidentally by power lines. Sometimes more sinister hands are to blame. Australian police believe this monstrous fire in southwestern Sydney may have been lit on purpose. Experts say that Australia's annual bushfire season is starting earlier and ending later. They believe that climate change is making the threat worse. Phil Mercer, BBC News, Sydney.
You're watching Newsday on the BBC, live from Singapore and London. Still to come on the program. The Twinkling Singers, how our night sky may not be so silent after all. We take a look at NASA's new mission. Welcome back, everyone. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore.
And I'm Karen Ginoni here in London. Our top stories: more fallout after the airstrikes on Syria as the US threatens new sanctions against Russia over its support for President Assad.
Hundreds of firefighters in Australia are battling a huge bushfire burning out of control near Sydney.
Let's take a look through some of the front pages from around the world. The situation in Syria continuing to dominate the headlines, focusing on many different aspects of the conflict. This article in the Straits Times looks at diplomatic efforts by the US, the UK and France in the wake of Saturday's strikes, as negotiations over a draft resolution are expected to begin on Monday. The New York Times explores how China's Communist Party is exerting increasing influence over business there, and how this is affecting foreign firms who are also dealing with the tension of an ongoing trade dispute with the US. And finally, Japan goes gaga for baseball star Shohei Ohtani after his electrifying debut in the Major League. This Japan Times says the 23-year-old's play and personal life are receiving excessive media attention.
Let's go back now to our lead story and the reaction to the airstrikes by the U.S., Britain and France on targets in Syria. I've been speaking to Michael Carpenter, who is the Senior Director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Eurasia. He told me how the strikes are being seen in the United States.
Well, I think in the media you've seen sort of a reflection of the various different views across the political spectrum here. So I think, except for folks on the Democratic left who have questioned whether the president has the authorization here, according to U.S. law, to carry out strikes in a mission that is fundamentally aimed at preventing Assad from using chemical weapons, there have been questions to that effect on the left side. On the right side of the political spectrum, especially on the far right, you've had a lot of concern about President Trump getting more enmeshed in Syria, potentially in the Syrian civil war itself. Of course, it was just a matter of a couple weeks ago that he said that he was withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria, so that's an about-face, or at least the strike is seen as an about-face in terms of that promise, and so there's quite a bit of concern on the far right. In the middle of the political spectrum, though, I think a lot of folks applaud the strike for having degraded Assad's military capabilities.
So overall, it's been a mixed reaction. And what is your major concern, Mr. Carpenter, of all this? Could it spark a confrontation with Russia?
Well, I think the way the strikes were carried out was designed to minimize risk of escalation with Russia. So the targets were carefully chosen and, in a sense, telegraphed by the president so that Russian advisors would not be there, although the specific targets were not pre-notified. But due course was paid to the risk of escalation. What I think the main concern now is that the strike was carried out completely unconnected from any larger strategy on Syria. So there's a question about whether the Trump administration, what its views are on regime change. Is it content to allow Assad to remain in power even if he continues to use chemical weapons? And, you know, we should remember that between last year's strike and this year's strike, there are reports of at least 36 uses of chemical weapons. So what does that say about deterrence for the future? And then there's the question of Iranian influence in the region and whether the United States will in fact withdraw from eastern Syria. And there doesn't seem to be a coherent strategy on all of these various different pieces and what the administration will do.
Michael Carpenter. NASA is set to launch a mission to look for planets around the stars closest to us. A critical part of the TESS mission is to capture the vibrations from those stars, which can be turned into sounds. And this will help researchers identify their age and size. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh has been to Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the Space Telescope is due to be launched on Monday night.
The night sky is littered with stars. They shine and they also sing. These are the vibrations of a distant star, similar to our sun, converted into sound. And this is another, much bigger and older star. Professor Bill Chaplin is analysing these sounds. Of course, there's no air in space, so the stars can't actually be heard, but they do vibrate and so generate sound waves. And Professor Bill Chaplin has discovered that each star has its own song, depending on how big and hot it is.
When we hear the sounds of the stars, first of all, it tells us that out of, if you like, this turbulence, this almost chaos, we get these ordered sounds. And it's incredible that, you know, stars resonate just like a musical instrument, and this gives us a way to actually study stars and see what their insides look like in a way that is just not possible by other means.
This will be the first mission to scan nearly the entire sky, sector by sector. The sound a star makes will tell scientists how big and how hot it is. Many of them will have planets in orbit around them. Some will be too close. Those that are the right distance away will be the ones most capable of supporting life in what scientists call the Goldilocks zone, where the temperature is just right. George Ricker is the mission's lead scientist. He believes that one day it might be possible to send probes to some of these distant worlds and see if there really is life out there.
There are about 100 stars that lie within within 20 light years of Earth, and if you were to send out an armada of probes to those, and you can basically get up to speeds of, say, 20% of the speed of light, then under those circumstances you could expect to reach these planets within 100 years.
In a few years' time we'll know how each of the stars in the night sky sound and whether the planets around them might harbour life. Prahlad Ghosh, BBC News, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
It is seen by many as one of the architectural wonders of the world. Angkor Wat in Cambodia was first visited by French explorers in the late 19th century. They were so impressed, they took some of the artifacts back to Paris, and the Parisians also fell in love. Well, these artifacts have remained there, held in a museum. That is until now, where they have made their first trip back to the region for an exhibit at the Asian Civilizations Museum here in Singapore. But earlier, I was joined by the director of the museum, Kenny Ting. So I explained why it is here in Asia.
We have about 141 pieces direct from Paris.
Wow, that's a large amount of pieces. And what is the biggest piece coming here to?
I'd say the biggest piece is this masterpiece. It's a four-headed, it's a statue of a four-headed Brahma, and it weighs about a ton.
And what really makes this exhibition really significant? Because it is a combination of artifacts from Cambodia and from France.
I think what makes it really unique is that we're presenting a fuller picture of the story of Angkor, so not just the Khmer artifacts, but also the artifacts related to the French encounter and reintroduction of Angkor to the world.
And how was Angkor Wat and Cambodia viewed by the French at that time?
At that time, I have to admit that the way the French actually approached and promoted Angkor was to exotify and romanticize it, which appealed to the colonial gaze at the time, but also made Angkor tremendously popular with the wider public.
And of course, Kenny, this is the largest loan ever. What was the process of getting all of these 100 pieces here to Asia?
It was tremendously difficult logistically, also because every one of these sculptures had to be individually placed on custom-made plinths because they were so heavy.
Why has it taken all this time to bring all of these pieces back to where it belongs here in the region?
I think it's because the time now is right. I think part of the reason why we were doing this was also because Singapore chairs the Association of Southeast Asian Nations this year, and we wanted to do something that relates to Southeast Asia. It also happens that we were commemorating 10 years of diplomatic relationship in the field of culture with France, so the stars were just aligned for us to work together. Yeah.
But I'm quite surprised that all these pieces are here in Singapore, and why not in Cambodia?
Well, I mean, the minute we knew that we would do this exhibition, I went over to Cambodia to speak to my counterpart at the museum, and we shared that, you know, it being in Singapore meant that it will reach out to a large international audience. And in particular, it was very much our intent to spotlight Angkor, which is a World Heritage Site, a heritage site that belongs to everybody, to the world.
So, Kenny, I'm sure it's also not cheap to transport these pieces from France, from the Guimet Museum, all the way here to Singapore. Do you think eventually Cambodians will experience seeing these works in their own home?
That's harder for us to say in Singapore. I think we see ourselves as more like a neutral place where certainly the opportunity is there with the exhibition being in Singapore for us to bring together Cambodian, French, and other international experts to discuss these issues. In fact, we have a conference on the 18th and 19th of May where we have precisely all these experts in town to look at future opportunities as well as current issues.
Looking forward to seeing this exhibition. Kenny Ting there from the Asian Civilizations Museum. And you've been watching Newsday on the BBC. Thanks for watching. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. Stay with us. For Design Dilemmas, coming up, what's the secret to a healthier, happier office? We'll be taking a closer look at how design can help create more productive workers.
And I'm Karen Giannoni in London. Before we go, just to bring you our favourite pictures, dozens of pugs and dachshunds and other dogs compensating for their lack of height and speed with dogged determination, taking part in Hong Kong's inaugural Doggy Dash to raise funds for abandoned and rescued canines. The lanes raced. They seemed happy enough, scampering across the finish line.